I'm Jamie Beebe.
And I'm Jake Deptula. We're the host of the Strictly Stalking podcast.
Strictly Stalking is a true crime podcast that explores stalking stories told by the survivors in their own words.
Join us every Tuesday as we interview survivors, advocates, and experts to give you a deep dive into the workings of a stalking case.
Would you know where to turn if you or someone you know is being stalked? We'll also give you the resources to fight back, know your rights, and get justice.
Find Strictly Stalking wherever you listen to podcasts from Podcast One.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. Today on the prosecutors, the moon is hollow. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my astronomical co-host, Alice.
Brett, it's so good to be back with you talking about something new.
Yes, it is so good. It is so good to be back with you too, Alice. I just want to give a shout out to Julie, who suggested that word. Julie is a student at Lidditz Elementary School, and she suggested that back when we were talking about lost cosmonauts. And we have returned to space today to try and do something completely different than what we've been doing for the last, I don't even know how many weeks, after the marathon, just intense, I don't even know how to describe it, experience that we had with the Adnan Syed case. We are pulling back. We're going to do something a lot different today.
I don't know if it's any lighter though, Brett. You see,
it's less dense though.
It's definitely less dense, and it might be lighter than what we've been doing. But the great thing about this is I think this might actually be more intense than Adnan, because what is more important than the thing that I look at every night? Around the world, we all look at the same thing, or so we think, the moon. And it is something that I thought, until I was older, illuminated the way for forlorn, lost wanderers in the night. But in fact, perhaps it's all a facade, and everything I have built my life on for the past many, many decades could turn out to be a hoax.
It could. And I got to say, our job here, one of our jobs, is to disabuse people of conspiracy theories. I have to say, this is easily one of my favorite, if not my favorite, conspiracy theories. The idea that the moon is hollow and everything that comes along with that. And look, if you're, this is not an April Fool's episode. I promise you, we are absolutely serious. This is a conspiracy theory that a lot of people believe. We're going to talk to you. We're going to tell you why people believe it. This is one that's actually kind of based in some science. Questionable science, maybe, but...
Can I also just check people's, it's not even privilege. I can't call it privilege, but I will tell you, growing up in an immigrant community and an immigrant family, I have never heard this conspiracy theory, because I think we all had better things to do, Brett, than to delve into this quandary, shall we say.
It's because the man was keeping you down, Alice.
The man was keeping me down. But now that the woman has risen, I have delved headfirst into this conspiracy theory, and I am in love with this, what we are about to do. So if you think, oh, this is not your typical true crime episode, I'm going to turn it off. Nay. Hang on. Hang on for a bit, because I think you're going to fall in love with this episode. It's already become one of my favorite conspiracy theories, thanks to Brett.
And I just want to give a shout out to the Y-Files. If you guys aren't watching the Y-Files on YouTube, number one, they're hilarious. Number two, really interesting. The reason I started watching them was because one day I'm scrolling through my YouTube feed. I watch a lot of sort of history and sort of strange things on YouTube. It's one reason I know a lot of random facts, because I like to watch like 10 coolest inventions of the Roman Empire or whatever. So I'm scrolling through, and the Y-Files had an episode on the Hollow Moon conspiracy, and I was like, well, I gotta watch this. I fell in love with it. Awesome YouTube channel. You will enjoy it. Check it out. They do a great episode on this very theory. And, you know, there's a movie about this, actually, called Moonfall. And I may have been one of the 8 people in the world who actually saw the movie Moonfall. It had like an incredible cast. It had Halle Berry was in it. The guy from The Conjuring was in it. I think it was him, was one of the main characters. The dude who, from Game of Thrones, who is like Jon Snow's good friend who goes down and becomes a maester. I can't remember his name. That Tully, Samwell Tully, that guy was in it. Great cast. Horrible movie. Just terrible. I mean, I enjoyed it.
Everyone has to pay the bills, Brett.
Everybody has to pay the bills. I enjoyed it, but it's based on this theory. So if you just get a kick out of this theory and you want to see a movie about it, Moonfall is the movie for you. Okay. I think we've done enough.
Okay.
We've done enough.
You know what? I didn't know this story. I didn't know this theory before we delved into it. So I bet a lot of our listeners actually have no idea what we're talking about. Brett, since you love this theory so much, please tell us what this is all about.
Yes, I will tell you. Okay, so guys, the moon. If there's one companion we've always had watching over us in the sky, it's the moon. The Bible says God created the moon on the 4th day, while modern science speculates that the moon is the result of a collision between a proto-Earth and a Mars-sized planet about 4.5 billion years ago. And basically that flung enough of the Earth's surface into orbit around the Earth that the moon was formed when it coalesced, which is, of all the moons in the solar system, that is probably a unique way that our moon was created, and may account for a lot of the unusual properties of the moon we're going to talk about as we go through this. The moon, Earth's moon, is so different from every other satellite in the solar system, and really every other satellite we have any knowledge of. And whatever you believe, there's one thing we can say for sure. As long as the Earth has been here, so has the moon. Or has it? There is a hypothesis, and I'm calling it a hypothesis because we have a science teacher who listens to the show and writes us to complain about the fact we call them theories when they're really hypotheses. I don't really know what the plural hypothesis. Hypotheses, there you go. Hypotheses. So I'm calling it a hypothesis that the moon is not what it seems. According to this idea, the moon is in fact hollow and quite possibly artificial.
To understand how anyone could believe this, you have to start with a theory you're probably more familiar with, even if you didn't know it. Hollow Earth. The idea that there is a subterranean world underneath the Earth's crust has been around as long as people. Think of Hades and the entrance to the underworld in Greek mythology. Go deep enough in a cave and you're liable to find a 3-headed dog. In fact, it's hard to find an ancient society that didn't believe the Earth was hollow. Caves and their unexplorable depths are the source of unlimited speculation.
And Hollow Earth really has been around for forever. And it's not just that, you look at a cave and you wonder where it goes, and it seems like it goes on forever, and who's brave enough to go all the way down there? There actually were some serious scientific thinkers who thought this was a possibility, and Edmund Halley, he of the comet, helped to lend scientific credence to this idea. And I'll read to you from Wikipedia how it's described. Edmund Halley in 1692 conjectured that the Earth might consist of a hollow shell, about 800 kilometers or about 500 miles thick, 2 inner concentric shells and an innermost core. Atmosphere separated these shells, and each shell had its own magnetic pole. The spheres rotated at different speeds. Halley proposed this scheme in order to explain anomalous compass readings. he envisioned the atmosphere inside as luminous and possibly inhabited, and speculated that escaping gas caused the aurora borealis. So basically, you can see here that there are some things in sort of the early days of science that people couldn't explain. One of them is, what in the world is the aurora borealis? Now, we now understand that that's charged particles from space, from the sun, hitting the atmosphere, and that's what causes that. But at the time, they obviously didn't know that, so he's trying to figure that out. So he's thinking, well, maybe there's gases escaping, and it's causing this light. The other thing you had is, we think of true north, and you think of the North Pole, where Santa Claus lives, according to Jason Usry, if no one else. So the North Pole is not magnetic north. And in fact, magnetic north moves around. So it's constantly moving into different locations. So when you look at a compass and you head north, hey, it's good enough for government work, right? It's good enough for most things. But if you keep going, you're not going to get to the North Pole, because the North Pole is not actually at magnetic north. And there was a question, why is that? And more importantly, why does it move? That seems like a strange thing. And so Halley said, well, look, if there are these concentric circles inside the Earth and there are hollow spaces, maybe that could explain why this is. Now we know that, in fact, the Earth, it's not solid, but it's also not hollow. And there is a lot of movement inside the Earth, including the Earth's core, its iron core, which spins. And the spinning of the Earth's iron core is actually what creates our magnetic fields, which are very important to life on Earth, and also cause the poles to move around and occasionally shift. And in fact, they can flip. North Pole can become a South Pole, and etc. So we know that now, but at the time, Edmund Halley, he's doing the best he can, and so he's coming up with sort of this idea that there might be some hollow spaces. And Halley, being, number one, a genius and famous and acclaimed, when he lends his name to this idea, all of a sudden, it gets some credence.
Yeah, and, the important thing here is that what you just said, Brett, Edmund Halley wasn't some wacko living in a cave by himself. He was incredibly respected when he put his name behind this theory. My favorite part about this, by the way, just because it's been in the news lately, is about other life forms, not just on the surface of the Earth, but instead of from outer space, this time, this theory is that the inner core, the hollow of the Earth could actually be home to a whole different species. So think about that when you go to sleep tonight. You don't just have to be afraid of aliens out there crashing into our atmosphere, but perhaps coming out from under us as we sleep.
This is why I love you, Alice, because I had no idea that you were aware of that theory, that in fact, aliens are not from outer space, they're from inner space. This idea that a highly technologically advanced civilization is creating these UFOs, and you're actually seeing them coming out of the Earth through various openings into this hollow Earth inner world, and not from outer space. So that is a theory. And look, we can laugh at UFOs all we want, but all of a sudden they seem like they have a lot more credence. We've got a lot of people in Congress talking about it. We're having hearings. It's a strange time in the UFO community.
All to say is, don't laugh too hard at what you perceive to be a wacky or maybe conspiracy theory, because I think we are seeing truly today those types of kind of sidelined theories coming more into mainstream media. And that's what Halley is trying to do back in 1692, right? Trying to make sense of the things that he's observing around him that he cannot account for with the scientific method. So, for a couple of centuries, this remained a viable theory, though as the decades passed, support dropped off until it reached the realm of pseudoscience and ended up where all pseudoscience went before the mid-20th century: the Nazis. Bet you didn't think I was going to go there, Brett. So the esoteric Nazi arm, the Thule Society, believed that a subterranean kingdom named Agartha may or may not have been the source of the Aryan race. Nazis. Proof that the world is not a simulation, because no storyteller would devise a villain as utterly insane as the Nazis.
And look, the Nazis were all over this stuff. Anything you've ever... What's so great about Indiana Jones is how accurate it is, right? So I don't know how many of y'all have seen the most recent Indiana Jones movie, but it starts off with the Nazis are looking for the Spear of Destiny. And this was 100% accurate. Whatever else happens in that movie, that part is 100% accurate. The Nazis wanted the Spear of Destiny, which is the spear that pierced the side of Jesus in the Bible when he was executed on the cross. It was believed that this spear, the Spear of Longinus, that this spear had incredible power and that whoever possessed it would rule the world. So, of course, Hitler wanted it. So they spent a lot of time looking for it. The Ark of the Covenant, the Grail, everything. They sent people to the Himalayas. They sent people to Antarctica. And in fact, a lot of people think the reason they went to Antarctica is because they were looking for an entrance to Agartha, which was supposedly a civilization that had massive technology, extremely advanced technology. Think Atlantis in the center of the earth, essentially. And that's what they wanted to find. And the Thule Society, which was connected to the SS and Heinrich Himmler, Hitler himself was less interested in some of this stuff, but Himmler was totally into it. He was totally into the occult stuff, and he was into this. And so this idea becomes this sort of, I mean, like Alice said, every other type of pseudoscience at some point coalesces in the Nazis, and so does this Hollow Earth, to the point that current conspiracy theories will tell you that the Nazis didn't just go to Argentina after the war. They went into the Hollow Earth, and there are like Nazis hanging out in the Hollow Earth, planning their eventual sort of reconquest, I guess, of the world. So be ready in case the Nazis ever start popping out of gopher holes or whatever. Like, they could be coming back at any time. So remain vigilant. But other than some, look, I don't like to, like I said, I like conspiracy theories, so I hate to just label everybody as a conspiracy theorist, but frankly, only really kind of hardcore conspiracy theorists at this point believe that the Earth is hollow. The theory that the Earth is hollow, it's largely been defeated by a scientific experiment, in particular that of observing seismic waves passing through the Earth's core. And the way you do this is whenever you have an earthquake, you can measure the amount of time that it takes for seismic waves to pass through the Earth and the way that they dissipate. And this can tell you what the Earth's interior is made of. And that essentially it is the crust, the mantle, and the core, the same configuration you're familiar with from elementary school. We've gotten a little bit more advanced, maybe since when you were reading about it in elementary school. The crust is now divided into two sections. So is the mantle, so is the core. So essentially you have 6 layers that the Earth is generally described as falling into. And when you measure these seismic readings, I mean, basically, if you have an earthquake on one side of the world and you're on the other side, you can measure the amount of time it takes for those seismic readings to reach you directly through the Earth, around the Earth, how long it takes for them to dissipate, and that tells you what they're passing through. It tells you how solid everything is, and you can, I mean, it's not like you can dig a hole to the center of the Earth, but using this, you can extrapolate from that information exactly how the Earth is designed. Alice, you're smiling at me. Did you have something you wanted to say?
No.
These episodes are very different when we're on the live feed, because normally, we're just on the phone, it's one thing, but when we can see each other, it's very different.
Well, I'm listening to our episode and thinking what other people are thinking, and like, have they lost their minds?
I tell you, all the people who hated our Adnan episodes could be like, see how crazy they are? They're talking about the Earth being hollow. How can you believe them on anything else? That's what they're saying.
I can see the reviews crawling out of the gopher holes.
Exactly. These are the people you believed.
Oh my goodness.
So I think, Alice, even though we're not talking about the Earth being hollow, I feel like we've basically debunked that theory. The Earth's not hollow.
You get a 2-for-1 over here. The moon and the Earth theories here.
But while the Earth may not be hollow, what about the moon? And with the moon, it's not that simple.
So let's talk about Apollo 12 and 13. It all started in 1969. That year, the United States landed on the moon, and we're not going to talk about that conspiracy theory because, yes, we absolutely landed on the moon during the Apollo 11 mission. The point was largely political and military, but since they were up there, they also took the opportunity to do some experiments. Later that year, Apollo 12 was launched, and NASA decided to perform some seismic experiments, much like the ones that Brett just talked about, that ended up essentially disproving hollow Earth theory. In order to do this, the Apollo 12 astronauts installed a seismic monitor on the surface, the Passive Seismic Experiment. When the astronauts were ready to leave, they climbed into the lunar lander and took off to the orbiting module above. Once in orbit, they deliberately released the lunar lander and allowed it to crash into the lunar surface. It hit with a speed of 6,000 kilometers per hour, which is the force of a ton of TNT, leaving a 9-meter wide crater. Then something totally unexpected happened.
And honestly, you're talking about the moon and whether we landed on the moon. The fact that NASA reported what we're about to talk about is proof we landed on the moon. Because there's no way they would have said this otherwise. There's no way they would have reported this. Because what happened was completely unexpected. It was something no one had ever seen before. And when they looked at the readings on the seismograph, it blew their minds. They hadn't seen anything like this. Never before had they seen anything like this on a seismograph, certainly not on Earth. So on Earth, and we talked about this, we've been looking at this a lot. We use this to figure out all sorts of theories about how the Earth is created, how it's made up, what's in the center, the fact that it's not hollow. And on Earth, the vibrations from earthquakes, they quickly reach their peak and then die away altogether in less than 30 seconds. The vibrations from the absolute strongest earthquakes we have ever measured in history don't last longer than 2 minutes, which, can you imagine being in a really terrible earthquake for 2 minutes? That'd be pretty horrible. But honestly, a lot of that you wouldn't be able to feel. That's going to be vibrations that are still being measured by seismographs long after you can feel it. But because of the way the Earth's made up, those vibrations, even in these really intense earthquakes, are going to be dampened and they're going to die away in about 2 minutes. And given the prevailing view for the moon's creation, which we talked about earlier, and the fact that the theory is you had sort of this proto-Earth and you had some sort of large object strike the Earth, and the moon was sort of carved out of the Earth, the expectation was moon's going to be a lot like the Earth. It's made out of the exact same stuff as the Earth is. We can expect to see similar things. We're going to do this. We're going to see some moonquakes and whatever that dissipate very quickly. But that's not what happened. That is not what they got. Instead, the vibrations started small, and it took them a while to get going. But as they did, they got stronger and stronger. And in fact, they got much stronger than anyone expected, and they did not stop. For more than an hour, the moon continued to vibrate, with waves bouncing back and forth through the moon, causing, in the words of a NASA scientist, the moon to, quote, ring like a bell. This same scientist noted that these vibrations just kept going and going.
NASA decided to up the ante on Apollo 13 because they could not make sense of the way these waves were continuing to ring through the moon. This time, they rammed the third stage of the Saturn V rocket into the moon with a force of 11 tons of TNT. It took 7 minutes for the vibrations to peak, with shock waves 30 times greater than Apollo 12 that lasted at least 4 hours. Scientists speculated that the lack of water on the moon might be to blame, and now, that's a pretty good theory back when we thought the moon was bone dry, but now we know the moon has 100 times more water than we ever thought. In fact, the interior has so much water that if you put all of that water the moon has within itself on its surface, it would make an ocean that would cover the entire moon a meter deep. Is the very science that had proved the Earth wasn't hollow now suggesting that it might be? But that's impossible. The laws of gravity simply wouldn't allow it. A large object will collapse into itself to form a solid mass. So how can this possibly be?
And, it's interesting because even someone in the chat suggested that it's the water that is the difference. And this was the theory that scientists put forward in the 70s for why you had this happen. The idea was, look, the moon has no water. There's no water in the rocks in the earth, and in fact, in the interior of the earth, there is more water captured in the rocks in the interior of the earth than in the oceans. And in fact, if you could remove all of that water from the rocks, there's about 3 times as much water in rocks in the interior of the earth as are in the ocean. And so the theory was, look, all of that water in the rocks in the interior of the earth dampens seismic waves. Since there's no water in the interior of the moon, the waves, they just bounce around and it's fine, no big deal. And that was a theory. But in the last 5 years or so, that has been completely disproven. As Alice said, the interior of the moon is much like the interior of the earth, at least on this point. The rocks on the interior of the moon have a ton of water in them. So much so that there are a lot of scientists who have been trying to figure out, are there ways that we can have moon colonies? The biggest problem with having a colony is taking water from Earth and bringing it wherever you are. You need that water. And if you can figure out a way to get the water out of the rocks, all of a sudden you're not going to need to do that. And that's all well and good, but it also makes you wonder about that original theory, about why the vibrations happen the way they did. If it's not water, and granted, there's more water on the Earth than there is on the moon, but there's a lot more water on the moon than we ever thought. If it's not water that's the difference, what is the difference? And as Alice said, if you're going to say the reason it rang like a bell is because it is a bell and there's a hollow in the middle just like a bell, well, the problem with that is gravity doesn't allow it. We talked about seismic waves, and that was one way we can figure out the way the Earth is constructed is you measure the seismic waves. But the other way is gravity abhors a vacuum, essentially. If you're going to have a rigid structure, if there's a gap large enough in its center, gravity is going to cause it to collapse. It's going to collapse in on itself, and you'll just have a smaller object. You're not going to have a big object with vast voids in the middle. It's going to collapse into a smaller object. And so that seems to defeat the theory. How could the moon be hollow? And that has led people to say it's not that it's just hollow and natural. And in fact, there were 2 Soviet scientists who, in the wake of the Apollo missions, suggested, and this is what led to this whole theory, something truly out of this world. What if the moon isn't just hollow? It's artificial. And this was proposed by Mikhail Vasin and Alexander Sherbokov, who were 2 members of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, in the appropriately named publication Sputnik. And their whole theory, and we're going to link to it. I'm going to link to a lot of stuff, so you can read all you want to about this, both from NASA and sort of scientific publications debunking this theory, as well as people who believe it has some validity. And you can read this entire article, and it is a wild article. And it sort of goes through this theory that basically the best way to explain the moon is not that it's a natural satellite, that it's something artificial. And they sort of explain all these theories, and a lot of the things we're going to point to are things that they pointed to in the beginning. Now, why are they doing this? On the one hand, and we talked about this before, the Soviets were a little bit less doctrinaire in some of their theories than maybe Western scientists, and you see that a lot. When you look at some of the things the Soviets were doing, they were just less rigid, and so they were more willing to sort of think about these ideas. There's a really interesting theory about this, though, that this is all part of sort of a Soviet sort of counterintelligence operation, that the Soviets are trying to undermine a Western, and I just love this period of history, that the Soviets are trying to undermine the Western reliance on religion. So the Soviet Union is communist. It is, godless communism, right? And so a lot of you are familiar with the ancient astronaut theory, which is basically aliens built it all. So point to anything. It was the aliens. The aliens built the pyramids. Aliens did this. Aliens did that. We didn't do anything. It was all the aliens. Oh, you've read the Bible and you hear about angels? Those were aliens, right? Well, there's a theory that all comes from the KGB, essentially. That the KGB came up with this whole idea to try and undermine Western religious traditions, and that this is part of that. And there's a guy who writes a lot of great blog post about this. His name, and I want to get it right, is Jason Colvito. We'll link to him as well. He has looked into this a lot. And his theory about all of this, including this article, is that this is all part of sort of a Soviet effort to undermine the Western faith and religion. Who knows if it is or not? What we know for certain is you have these 2 scientists who are relatively well respected who are writing this article, and it is pointed to this day as sort of the first example of this. And what's interesting about this conspiracy theory is, unlike the hollow earth, which goes all the way back to the 1600s and really goes all the way back as far as you can go, this is a new one. This one really did come out of the fact that we landed on the moon and we started to do these experiments and we started to learn things about the moon. And it's not just the seismic waves. And we're going to talk about some of those other things as we go on.
So I know we're like kind of flying through we're just throwing one kind of off the wall theory at you after another, but there may be evidence to support this theory that the moon isn't just hollow, that it's also artificial. And one of them is shallow craters. One thing people notice about the craters on the moon, whether you're looking into the sky or looking at pictures from satellites, is that no matter their width, they tend to be quite shallow. Some of the largest craters on the moon have a depth of 1/15th to 1/25th their diameter, meaning that in relative terms, they're shallower than a dinner plate. Why would this be? Well, according to our Russian friends, there is a solid sphere of some high-grade metal below the stony surface of the moon we see. Depending on how deep that surface strata goes, that determines the depth of the craters. Once they reach the surface of the sphere, they stop.
And to give you sort of an idea of what this would be, so there's a theory out there. There's a theory out there about the Kardashev scale, which some of you have heard about. And the Kardashev scale describes the amount of energy that you can use as a civilization. Our civilization is like 0.5 on the Kardashev scale. And 1 means that you can use all of the energy on your planet. So, you're getting everything you can out of it. And the more energy you have, the more advanced your civilization is going to be. Because everything requires energy. More than anything, everything requires energy. The number 2 on the scale is if you're getting all the energy out of your sun. And there's something called a Dyson sphere. And a Dyson sphere is essentially a megastructure. We call it a megastructure that you build around the sun, where you are harnessing the energy of the sun, most of which is lost into space, for your civilization. And in fact, this has been suggested as a way that we can look for civilizations throughout the galaxy. If we see a star, and we see unusual dimming of the star that can't be explained through any natural phenomenon, that could be an example of a Dyson sphere. About 2 years ago, scientists found a star just like this, and there was all sorts of news. You may have seen it. They eventually probably came up with a more natural explanation for it, but nevertheless, it's something that people talk about. So the theory here from our Russian friends, we'll continue to refer to them as our Russian friends. This is all KGB.
I don't think they would call us their friends,
but it's essentially that the moon, and they talk about this in their article, is that the moon it's not just hollow, but at the center of the moon would be some sort of star. So a neutron star or a white dwarf, and it's from that this megastructure is getting its energy and is sort of brought into our atmosphere. So this is like a wild theory. I mean, it's crazy, right? But you can see sort of, fringe science, real science, how it ties into this. And so that's the idea that they are proposing when they say things like there is this solid sphere. I mean, why would there be a solid sphere of metal this massive? Because the moon is huge. I mean, it's huge. I mean, this would be a massive construction. And the idea is this is an example of one of these Dyson spheres that we now think, at least, are feasible. I mean, this is not something that's impossible. With a technology vastly superior to what we have, you could do it. And these Russians, in their article, are basically talking about a society that was incredibly advanced, that built this, and went looking for life, and basically found the Earth and thought, hey, this is the kind of place there's going to be life. Let's park our little space station up here and watch it develop. And I think their theory is this civilization is gone. That basically the moon is still a dead world. There's nobody there. It's not like they're watching us. But nevertheless, that is how it got there in the first place. So, shallow craters. That's the first thing. The second thing, uranium-236 and neptunium-237. So uranium-236 and neptunium-237 have been found on the surface of the moon. And there's enough of this material that some have suggested, and you can read this in mainstream scientific publications, that we can build nuclear power plants on the moon and use the resources there to fuel those power plants for whenever we eventually want to build colonies on the moon. Or if we don't want to do that, we could mine the moon for the nuclear resources we need to fuel nuclear power plants on Earth, since uranium is a fairly rare element. And that's great, but there's a problem. Uranium-236 and Neptunium-237 are artificial. They have never been known to occur in nature. So how is it possible that such large amounts of these materials are on the moon? And the reason they're artificial is because they are generally created through some sort of nuclear fission. The idea being whatever powers this space station is possibly it's nuclear, and that this is actually just nuclear waste. And it's left over from whatever happened in the past, and that's why we're finding it on the moon.
So those are not the only weird things about the moon. For one, the moon's orbit is almost perfectly circular. The moon is big, as Brett's already mentioned, and although it's the 5th biggest moon, it is by far the largest moon relative to its planet. In fact, it's about a quarter of the size of the Earth. And yet, the volume of the moon is 2% of the Earth. The moon is only 1.2% the mass of the Earth, despite being a quarter the size. In other words, it would take 81 moons to make an Earth. And the moon's density is only 3.53 grams per cubic centimeter, whereas the Earth's density is 5.52 grams per cubic centimeter. Then there are the rocks. Moon rocks are older than Earth rocks. Moon rocks are magnetic, even though the moon has no magnetic field. So, this is blowing out of the water the theory that a proto-Earth was somehow struck and a piece of it floated off and became the moon. If moon rocks are older than anything we find here on Earth, and as we've talked about, there are definitely magnetic poles that flip back and forth on Earth, but there are no magnetic fields on the moon, yet moon rocks are magnetic. Before we move on, I have to tell all of you about a podcast that I think you're going to really enjoy, and that's Deadly Nightmares, the podcast from ID. It tells the real stories of people stalked by serial killers and attackers. On every episode, survivors share the chilling moments they knew their lives were in danger and how they had managed to escape their attacker. Investigators and family members close to the victims discuss the disturbing details of each case and exactly how they happened. These terrifying cases are the stuff of nightmares, but they've happened in real life to real people. After listening to this podcast, you'll never drive alone at night again. Check out one of their first episodes, The Curse of Dismal Creek. It's about a 33-year-old man, Sean Farmer, who's on his way to meet his friend Scott Johnson at a campsite deep in the backwoods of Virginia. They plan to fish along remote Dismal Creek, unaware that the area has a dark past. In 1981, 2 young hikers were murdered there, stabbed and shot by a stranger they met along the nearby Appalachian Trail. Decades later, as Sean starts to set up camp near the same spot, a mysterious stranger appears. Is the terrible history of Dismal Creek doomed to repeat itself? Find out at Deadly Nightmares. Listen to Deadly Nightmares wherever you listen to your podcasts. Brett, before we move on, I know that we are all facing a really busy time of life right now. I know I struggle to get to the grocery store, meal plan, and actually get the cooking done to feed my family. Enter HelloFresh, one of the most invaluable players in my household. With HelloFresh, you get farm-fresh, pre-portioned ingredients and seasonal recipes delivered right to your doorstep. Skip trips to the grocery store and count on HelloFresh to make home cooking easy, fun, and affordable. That's why it's America's #1 meal kit. And here's what's exciting. You can kickstart a fresh fall routine with HelloFresh. HelloFresh handles all the meal planning and shopping to deliver everything you need to cook up a tasty meal right at home. They do the hard part, and you get to take the credit. My kids always cheer on HelloFresh nights. They love the food that is on the menus, and it comes with so many options, and more is more. That's why HelloFresh's menu includes 40 recipes and over 100 add-on items to choose from every week. When you get HelloFresh, you know you're getting top-notch produce since it travels from the farm to your door in less than 7 days. Come see why we love HelloFresh so much. Go to HelloFresh.com/50TP and use code 50TP for 50% off plus 15% off the next 2 months. That's HelloFresh.com/50TP and use code 50TP for 50% off plus 15% off the next 2 months. And find out with us why HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Do you ever find that just as you're trying to fall asleep, your brain suddenly won't stop talking? Do your thoughts start racing right before bed or at other inopportune moments? I know with trying to keep up with my family schedule, all the work I have to do, keeping up with the podcast, sometimes I just can't shut down my brain. I, like so many people, can benefit from learning positive coping skills, and that's what BetterHelp can offer you here. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Get a break from your thoughts with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/prosecutors today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/prosecutors. Angie has made it easier than ever to connect with skilled professionals to get all your home projects done well. If you own a home, you know how much work it can take. Whether it's everyday maintenance and repairs or making dream projects a reality, it can be hard just to know where to start. But now, all you need to do is Angie that and find a skilled local pro who will deliver the quality and expertise you need.
And Alice, you can turn to Angie with confidence no matter what the size of your home or the size of your project. Whether you've got a 100-year-old house like I do where it seems like things are always breaking, or if you're renting and you're needing someone to help you with moving, installations, or cleaning, Angie is there for you, and they're there for you with confidence. So, Angie has over 20 years of home service experience, and they've combined it with new tools to simplify the whole process. Bring them your project online or with Angie's app, answer a few questions, and Angie can handle the rest from start to finish. Or they can help you compare quotes from multiple pros and connect instantly, which means you can take care of just about any home project in just a few taps. Because when it comes to getting the most out of your home, you can do this when you Angie that. Download the free Angie mobile app today or visit Angie.com. That's ANGI.com. Check them out today. Angie.com. ANGI.com. And whatever you think of this theory, I mean, these are some interesting things. I mean, the fact that the moon is, a quarter the size of the Earth, and yet in volume and mass is just minuscule compared to the Earth. It's not a quarter of the volume. It's not a quarter of the mass. It is 2%, 1.2%. Density is not as dramatic, but is a good bit lower than what you see on the Earth. And this is, once again, why would this be? Why would the volume be so low? Why would the mass be so low? Well, maybe it's because there's nothing in the middle. It's just what you're seeing. You're seeing an object that appears to be a quarter of the size of the Earth, and yet it is missing a vast amount of mass. How do you explain that? You got the rocks that are older than the rocks that you see on the Earth, and then you see that they are magnetic, which is unusual since the moon is not. And then there are the moon legends. So according to the legends of the Proselyans, who say they were in Arcadia before there was a moon in the heavens. The culture at Tiwanaku says the moon arrived around 13,000 years ago. And then there are the Zulu, and the Zulu have the most interesting legend about the moon. According to an article called "The Moon is a Death Star," yes, that is the title. Here's how they describe this legend. The legend goes that the moon was brought here hundreds of generations ago by two brothers, Wawane and Mupanku, who were the leaders of reptilian extraterrestrials. Lizard people, yeah. They were the water brothers and had scaly skin like a fish.
There's really nothing more I can say about that, Brett. Except, strangely, it's not the only story like that, because this story is similar to the Mesopotamia and Sumerian accounts about the two leader brothers, Enlil and Enki, Lord of the Earth. Basically, what we're saying is this may sound completely wacky to you, but really these stories have been around for much longer than our theory now that, for example, the Earth is round or the Earth is not hollow. And so think about it. Why have these theories and these stories been around for so long? Could there be some truth in them? The Zulu legend tells of how Wawane and Mpenku stole the moon as an egg from the great fire dragon and emptied the yolk until it was hollow. They then rolled it across the sky to the Earth and caused cataclysmic events on this planet, the end of the Golden Age.
It's pretty dramatic, Alice. It's pretty dramatic. You know, it makes you wonder, is the moon hollow? And as I've said, I love this conspiracy theory. It's my favorite conspiracy theory. I know it's my favorite one, but I like it a lot. It's way up there in my conspiracy theory land. And I really, really, really want to believe it. I don't know why. I just think it would be more interesting if the moon was a giant spaceship. Really want to believe it. But there are problems. And sadly, I know you guys are all going to be shocked to learn this. The moon is probably not hollow. So let's go through the evidence. We've talked about a lot of this, but let's talk about it in more detail. So let's talk with the shallow craters. We talked about shallow craters in the beginning. So most of the craters that people point to as examples of this phenomenon are really, really old. And in fact, as you would probably expect, fresher craters are much deeper. Relatively speaking, we're talking more like a soup bowl. Alice mentioned before that these craters we're pointing to were more like a dish, like a plate, not very shallow at all, but newer craters are much deeper. And this is not all that surprising. Now, people get confused by this because they'll say things like, why are these craters so shallow? There's no erosion on the moon. So it must be there's a metal shell and that's what's causing it. But there is erosion on the moon. There's no water on the moon and there's not much of an atmosphere, but there is erosion. So you have the solar wind, which is constantly pounding the moon. And you have micrometeorites. Now, both the solar wind and micrometeorites are deflected or burned up by our atmosphere. That's why we don't experience that, though the solar wind hitting the atmosphere is one of the reasons you see those auroras that we mentioned earlier. But you don't have that on the moon. They're just slamming right into the moon. And so you're going to have erosion of these older craters so that they become shallower and shallower. And there's also something that we should be familiar with by now. Moonquakes. Their great length contributes to eroding away the edges of craters. When you have a moonquake, as we said, it goes on forever. So even if it's relatively low in intensity, it's going to break down those crater walls in a way that you're not going to see on Earth. So on Earth, you will see really old craters that are still very well defined, despite the fact you have water and wind erosion. On the moon, you're just not going to see that. And over enough time, these deep craters are going to become quite shallow.
And what about the artificial elements that we talked about that don't appear in our nature? Uranium-236 and Neptunium-237. We're learning that just because we don't see something happen on Earth, shocking, doesn't mean it doesn't happen in other places. These reactions were likely created by high proton flux bombardments from massive solar flares slamming into the moon's surface, once again, without the benefit of an atmosphere. So a lot of what we describe as nature is an environment that our nature is in. So much of what we experience is because of the environment that we live in, having an atmosphere that is obviously not the same in other planets and certainly not at our moon.
And in fact, we've even seen examples of natural nuclear reactors here on Earth, which is something that people just didn't believe was possible. And when they saw this, I mean, it's a similar thing. There was evidence of nuclear reactors that were thousands of years old, and people said, oh my gosh, there must have been a civilization thousands of years ago that had nuclear reactors. This is insane. But then they figured out that, in fact, if you have the right collection of elements and the right circumstances, you can have a nuclear reaction that happens naturally. And so you see that even on the Earth, and on the moon, things are just very different. And this is one of the things the people who believe in the moon hoax fail to understand. If you watch sort of moon hoax videos, they'll point to all sorts of stuff the astronauts are doing, and they'll be like, see, that looks totally unnatural. Well, it's because it is. It is totally unnatural. If you're on the moon with, a mass that's 1% of the Earth's, all sorts of stuff is going to look weird. It's not, there is no atmosphere. There's, why don't you see stars? Why is there a black sky but no stars? Because it's still daylight. There's no oxygen in the air, so the air doesn't appear to be blue, but it's still daylight, and you can't see the stars because of the daylight. Like, all of these things, people forget that the moon is an alien world, and so you can't apply what you would expect to see on the Earth to the moon and then use that as proof that, in fact, there's something insane going on the moon, whether it's us not landing on it or it being hollow, as much as it hurts my soul to say that. Okay, what about the stuff about the moon rocks? Talked about the moon rocks. Well, moon rocks are older than Earth rocks, but it's because our tectonically active planet recycles rocks. Rocks are constantly being recycled because of the action of the tectonic plates, because of magma and volcanic eruptions. And so, in fact, you don't see rocks from the period of the Earth when the supposed collision happened that created the moon. Now, look, that is a hypothesis. I continue to use that instead of theory about the way the moon was created. There are several different ones. None of them are perfect, including that one. But regardless of how the moon came to be, it's not that surprising that you would find rocks on a tectonically dead moon that have been sitting there since the moon was created, or at least cooled down, whereas you don't see that on Earth. As far as moon rocks being magnetic, because, well, that's actually a little bit of a mystery. We don't actually know why they're magnetic. The best guess we have is the moon may have had a strong magnetic field at one time, and the magnetism is residual. That's a guess. I mean, this was really surprising to scientists. They did not expect to find magnetic rocks on the moon. And their theory was, let's see, it could be an alien civilization built a Dyson sphere and brought it here across thousands of light years, and in doing so also brought some magnetic rocks. Or maybe the moon used to be magnetic. Which one are we going to pick? We talk about Occam's razor a lot. This is a good example of Occam's razor. You don't know. We don't know why they're magnetic. And we have two options. One is, the moon used to be magnetic. The other is, the moon is a megastructure created by aliens. Which one is going to make it through the razor? Probably the fact that it used to be magnetic. We can't prove that right now, though the fact that we have magnetic rocks is proof that the moon may have at one time been magnetic.
As for the density, mass, and volume, the theory is that the impact that created the moon mostly involved the Earth's surface and not its dense core. So what the moon got wasn't all that much. But there's also the fact that relative to other moons, the moon is dense. It's the second densest moon in the solar system behind Io. And while the moon is less dense than the Earth is the densest object in the solar system by far. So honestly, that's probably not all that significant if you're comparing the density of the moon to the densest object in the solar system, Earth.
And look, this is not to say that the moon is boring, or the moon isn't interesting, or the moon isn't super cool. There are mysteries about the moon, tons of them. And even some of the explanations above, they're hypotheses. We don't know. I mean, it's one of the reasons the moon is so interesting to study, and it's one of the reasons we want to go back there. And as much as we know about the moon even now, we still have a lot to learn. And so while it may not be an ancient spaceship piloted by reptilians who crossed the galaxy to come here, it is special. And in fact, It's almost miraculous.
The moon is incredibly important to life on Earth, and it has some unique properties. You know, we've made it through almost an entire episode without talking about our kids, but I think both of our kids right now are in real space phases of their life. Like my son, my 3-year-old, is an astronaut all day long. All he wants to do is talk about the moon and the earth and the stars. And to be honest, I didn't understand what was the big deal about going to the moon, right? It was cool. Obviously, for geopolitical reasons, it was important to show our strength for the space wars. But in fact, like you said, the moon actually is incredibly miraculous, and it is our companion in this world. It has been our companion for as long as we know, and it likely will continue to be so. And it has these properties that we can't explain based on all the science that we know now. We might know more in a few decades, we might not. It appears to be the same size as the sun in the sky because the sun is 400 times the size of the moon, and the distance from the Earth to the sun is 400 times the distance to the moon, allowing for nearly perfect solar eclipses, something that happens nowhere else that we know of. And if you've ever been able to see one, it really does look like you're seeing something otherworldly. It's incredible to watch a solar eclipse. The moon keeps the Earth from wobbling on its axis. It causes seasons and it causes tides, might cause werewolves to come out or hormone shifts. Who knows? Without it, life as we know it could not exist. And that's not a joke whatsoever.
Yeah, so pull one out for the moon. And the next time you look up in the sky and see the moon, even if it's not hollow, which it might be, you never know, be thankful that it is always with it. But just to be safe, don't look too closely, because the moon might just be looking back.
Whew. That was a wild ride.
Oh, I love it. I love it. I love these kind of topics. I know, look, we do these every now and then. We do sort of the strange and different, and we dive into the world of conspiracy theories or whatever. But, I love this stuff. I mean, this is what makes life interesting.
We sometimes, what I think is very helpful about episodes like this one? A lot of us get sucked into Reddit wars, Twitter wars, where you think the other side is off the wall on their theories. And this is a helpful reminder that we have had kind of off the wall ideas about how everything works around us, down to the very core of our very existence, since the beginning of time. We have folklore about it. We draw cave drawings about them, and we've spent our lives, building all these stories to explain the unexplainable. This is what we do. As podcasters, we know this. We really do storytell to try to make sense of the world around us. And while you may think this topic is completely off topic, it's not, because this is what we do in our lives, is try to make sense of the unexplainable.
And this is how I got into true crime. I got into true crime because I really like mysteries. That's how I got into true crime. I started off with mysteries, things like the Mary Celeste, things like the Lost City of Z, all that stuff, conspiracy theories. This idea of trying to sort of explore these things, debunk these things when necessary. To me, that's what's really interesting. And I think there's a reason, the paranormal stuff, I think there's a reason that a lot of people who are interested in true crime are interested in that kind of stuff. They're interested in the paranormal. They're interested in those things. And you see that in a lot of podcasts. A lot of podcasts that do true crime will also do these sort of more esoteric, paranormal type things. And I think one of the reasons is that we like the unknown. It's what draws us to true crime. It's what draws us to this kind of stuff. People have been looking at the moon for a long time. The moon is made of cheese, right? That's what people used to say. Maybe it's Swiss cheese. That's why it's hollow. Who can say? But I really enjoy this stuff, and I think a lot of people out there enjoy it as well. And we're always interested in doing these kind of things. We always ask you guys for recommendations, but if you have interesting theories, sort of pseudoscience-y, conspiracy theory type stuff you want us to look at, I enjoy looking at this. Like I said, this is one of my favorite conspiracy theories. I enjoyed going through it. I enjoyed seeing the counter arguments, which seem pretty powerful to me. I don't think the moon is probably hollow, unfortunately. It seems the moon, the general theory, by the way, if you're curious, is that the moon does have a small core. It's much smaller than the Earth's. Mostly the moon, the reason the volume and the density is so low is just like Alice said, it's really made up of sort of more like the surface of the Earth, not the deep core, the iron core of the Earth, which is obviously very dense, and gives the Earth a lot of its mass, gives the Earth its magnetic poles, all that stuff. So anyways, we're interested in this kind of stuff, and we hope you guys are too. Just if anybody's wondering, I'm drinking Navigator bourbon tonight. I'm going to start sharing my bourbons. Navigator bourbon, which is out of California, and I sort of think, bourbon has come from Kentucky. Interestingly, the bottle says Kentucky on it, so I'm not clear where the Kentucky comes in. Really awesome bottle, though. Very good. It's aged in red wine casks, so if you're into bourbon, it has a really smooth taste. I got it at the Liquor Barn in Lexington, but I think it probably is more available out west. Like I said, fantastic bottle, and it's cheap. $20 a bottle. Really hard to find solid bourbon these days for $20 because all you guys are buying all the bourbon up. Stop drinking bourbon. It's my admonition to you. But check it out. Try it. It is pretty good. Alice, do you want to answer questions?
Sure.
You have time for questions? This has been a relatively short episode.
I got all the time in the world for
all
questions.
The time in the world.
While you do that, I will say this, talking about now the esoteric reasons for talking about the moon. The very first poem just about any Chinese kid learns is a poem about the moon that dates back to basically the Tang Dynasty of like 600 AD. And it starts, 床前明月光, which means that you're sitting at the foot of your bed looking at the reflection of the moon. And it like rolls off the tongue of just about like any child. And I say it to my kids too. And that kind of just shows you how the moon has captivated all of us from really the beginning of time. And it's become kind of ingrained in so much of our poetry and our artwork. And we continue to be fascinated, and it comes out in different ways.
And look, I love the moon. We're kind of harping on the moon at this point, but I love the moon. I've always loved the moon. But my kids love the moon so much. And it makes me love the moon even more. Like, my daughter, when she sees the moon, she used to like reach up and try and reach the moon. And she'd say, I can't reach it. And it's like, ah. It's just so sweet.
With that, I have recorded, when they have their like baby voices, my son, who's now 5, who doesn't have a baby voice anymore, I have recorded him saying, oh, moon. And I play it on my phone because it's like childhood.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. The moon's great. The moon is great. And I'm glad it's not hollow. Okay.
I'm glad it's not hollow, but I would like if it were cheese.
Okay. Let's do some questions. Okay, this is from Emily, and this is an interesting one. I'm interested to hear what you think about this, Alice. Okay. So, you're arrested for a crime. And we're going to do this guilty and innocent. Would you want a jury or a judge?
A judge. Because if I were innocent, well, no,
this is a tough one. It's a tough one.
It's a tough one. I jumped to judge because, man, we've talked about the black box of the jury. Okay, if I'm guilty, I want a jury. If I'm innocent, I want a judge. And the reason is if I'm guilty, I think it would be difficult for the judge not to follow the law and apply the facts as they are to the law, but the jury doesn't actually have that charge. The jury can nullify all they want. They can feel sorry for me. I can cry. I can pull off whatever shenanigans I want. I can bring up every character witness in life about how she lit up her room and she changed life for the better and she would deliver food to the poor, whatever. Make them sad for me, and it doesn't matter that I killed somebody. They're going to be like, you know what? She doesn't deserve to be in prison. You just need one to change one's mind. And again, they don't have to necessarily apply the facts to the law the way the judge has to, because he is held accountable by appellate courts.
I think if you're innocent, you're much more likely to be convicted by a jury than a judge. I agree with you 100%. I think if you're guilty, honestly, a lot of times when you're guilty, you're just looking for the one. You just need one person. Because if you can get that hung jury, maybe the prosecutor's like, whatever, this isn't worth it. Maybe they give you a deal. I agree with you. I think, because the great thing is, if you're guilty, you go with the jury. If the prosecution doesn't prove its case, you can always get a directed verdict. The judge can always decide not even going to a jury. Going to give you the directed verdict because the prosecution didn't prove its case. If I'm innocent, I think I want a judge, because I think a judge is much more likely to see through the sort of problems with the prosecution's case. Now, look, I love the jury system, and so maybe this feels like in opposition to that, but I love the jury system because of what it represents in our entire the way we are ruled. Like, I like the fact that
because it is
not
it stands in the way of tyranny.
Exactly. It stands in the way of tyranny. The jury is always a bulwark against tyranny. But if it's me and I'm innocent, I'm thinking I'd rather have a judge.
And here's the thing, that the jury stands in the way of tyranny is actually not in tension with what you just said, Brett, because you as the criminal defendant have the right to waive your rights. So you have a right to a jury trial, but you don't have to go down that route.
And I'll say this, I mean, depending on the complications of my defense, if my defense is really complicated and hard to understand, I'm probably more likely to want a judge as well. Because I think a judge is probably more likely to understand the complications than a jury. Now, having said that, we've all seen older judges who do not understand technology, and that becomes a problem. And you see that in cases where judges just don't get it. They don't understand technology at all. You know, it's funny. There was this massive litigation. I forget, it was between like Apple and Amazon over publishing. And the judge was like 98 years old. And they're trying to explain, you know, the intricacies of copyright law and internet publishing and all this other stuff on this patent case. And this judge is like, this is a nightmare. This is a nightmare for everyone involved. But that can happen.
My judge had to ask from the bench while I was clerking for him what a butt dial was. Which I can see how that is not just absolutely clear if you have no idea what that term means.
Yeah, no, I can totally see that.
So.
All right, let's see. This is from Air Daedria. Do your spouses listen to or inform your podcast? How do they support you? Please feel free to share what you love about them and brag on your spouses in your reply.
Oh, I love our spouses. They absolutely are part of this team, because if you can't tell, we are able to record this podcast without children bursting in, and that is because of our spouses.
And they're probably watching right now. We always send them the link, so at least 2 of you are probably our spouses. And yeah, I mean, they're super supportive. You know, we all 4 of us have really complex, complicated lives, and I would like to think we're all supportive of each other in that, even across spouse, you know, trying to make it work. But it's like everything, you can't do anything by yourself. And as Alice said, there are a lot of times where I will leave recording and go downstairs, and one of my children will have decided to wake up and watch Daddy and Miss Alice talk. There's a lot of, I don't know if my wife sent you that video from bath time.
I did.
Where they were all talking to Miss Alice on there.
It was the sweetest thing. I actually got to hang out with your son today. He came over and he kept saying, Miss Alice. So I was like, oh, my heart. Yeah, no, we have pretty much the greatest spouses ever, because as you can tell, I mean, we spend hours sitting in a closet, in my case, talking to someone who isn't my spouse. But that's part of the fun too, is they watch a lot. They listen to the podcasts with us, not our podcast, like our podcast research. They watch a lot of true crime documentaries and movies with us. So they are totally researched on these issues, and they often have their own takes, and they tell us what we get wrong. So that's very important.
Yeah, and as many of you know, my wife often brings me refills on bourbon, which is important. And used to, I mean, when we first did this, we recorded our first episode and we're getting ready to release it. I must have listened to that episode 30 times. And my wife had to listen to it every single time. Before Jason came along, you know, I would do the editing, so she would hear me edit the podcast. So she's always been very supportive, and could not do it without her. Okay, let's do one more.
Okay.
And then we'll go.
We got this.
Okay, this was a really good one. So if you need to take a moment to think about it, Think about it.
Okay.
And this is a tough one, too, because Jen is asking a very difficult question. What is one book and or documentary that you think everyone should read/watch? Ideally, something that we may not know about.
Oh, that's hard. That's hard.
That is really hard.
Jeez. I don't know. I mean, other than like the Bible, which is like an obvious answer because whether you believe it or not, it's like, you know, the most printed piece of literature. And it's helpful to know all the references and to know how to fight with it because obviously something that very much annoys me in any discussion is when someone tries to attack your arguments, like perhaps our Adnan episodes, without having listened to them yet. And so a lot of the major wars and disputes throughout history have stemmed from religion and specifically Christianity and the Bible. And so I do think I had a professor who was not at all a Christian in college who said that. He was in the political sciences department. And he said, every single person should read this book, the Bible, from cover to cover to be a learned and well-read person because this is the basis of most of the conflict and also most of the flourishing in societies that we've seen throughout history. So to understand those conflicts and to understand what has risen and what has fallen, you have to kind of understand what has been the driving force through a lot of societies. And many religions obviously kind of orbit it or take elements of the Bible as well. So I had never read it when he said that, read it from cover to cover in that way. I'd gone to church and, read a lot of it and taken verses out of context. But he said, no, you need to read it cover to cover and understand every bit of context of it. So that's not unknown, but I wonder how many people have actually sat down and done so, and not with an eye towards you're sitting in church doing it, but reading it from that perspective of a lot of our civilization, the turmoils, the bumps, the highs and the lows have all come out of this document.
Yeah, and I'll say this. I mean, there's so much good art comes out of people who know the Bible, who aren't necessarily religious. Like, I always think about that when it comes to, like, song lyrics. I always notice really, really great song lyrics that, have biblical references or whatever. So that's an interesting one. I mean,
like Mumford and Son. I mean, they're not a Christian band. I don't think they are at all. But their lyrics, I think, are some of the most beautiful lyrics because they are so raw about the human experience. And if you really read their lyrics, I actually have no idea what their religious beliefs are so deeply rooted in biblical knowledge, whether they know it or not.
Yeah, Bob Dylan is famous for that. I mean, Bob Dylan at some point had some sort of religious sort of conversion, but even before that, so much of his music has those sort of biblical tie-ins, which I think are interesting. Let's see. It's hard to compete with the Bible,
with that,
Alice.
I'm sorry. So with that, like maybe I'll give you an artist that no one's ever heard of because I've never heard of him. He's been around for more than a decade, and his lyrics are, I think, draw inspiration from like biblical metaphors, but they're not explicit. I did not know that he was a Christian when I first heard him, but I think he is one of the most gifted artists I have discovered in the last several years, and it's Josh Garrels. Have you ever heard him?
No.
Okay, his songs, there are certain songs that he has that actually bring me to tears in a way that very few songs have the effect on me. And it's his story writing ability, and it's also, he has a beautiful voice as well. So my You've Never Heard will be Josh Garrels. I will plug him. He doesn't know me. He lives on a farm, I think in the middle of nowhere, Michigan, perhaps. And all he does is like sit in this big barn and write songs and self-prints his like CDs and like stamps them himself. He's like not technological at all. And I think he gives away his music every year, which is how I found him. He just like has it for free once a year, whatever you want to download. You don't have to pay anything unless you want to. But give him a listen because, like you said, some of the most beautiful artwork throughout history has come from a knowledge of the Bible, whether you believe it or not.
Okay, so So I'm trying to find the name of a documentary right now because I want to share that. But before I get to that, let me think. Okay. So, like I said, competing with Alice and the Bible. All right. So for music, I will say, so this guy named Josh Ritter, some of you may have heard of him. He's very different. He's very good. He is underappreciated. He has fantastic lyrics. He has this one song called The Temptation of Adam. We're talking about biblical references. The Temptation of Adam is the most clever song I think I have ever heard. I have been to multiple Josh Ritter concerts where he plays that song around people who've never heard it, and watching those people as he performs the song is incredible. I don't want to give it away, but you guys should all check it out. Josh Ritter, Temptation of Adam, all this stuff is great. As far as literary stuff, so I love H.P. Lovecraft, who is not unknown, but is probably unknown to a lot of people. H.P. Lovecraft is the basis. He was a writer who wrote primarily in the 20s and 30s. He is the basis for essentially all horror and science fiction today. His theory of horror was basically, so much of horror up to that point had been very human-centric, which you would expect because you're writing for people. But his whole theory was, no, the universe doesn't care about you. And because the universe doesn't care about you, the horror of the universe is so much greater than you could ever imagine. And that idea has become a real basis for horror going forward. So if you have not read H.P. Lovecraft, you should. Okay, so on true crime documentaries, the name of the documentary is Dear Zachary, A Letter to a Son About His Father. And it is the most powerful true crime documentary you will ever watch. The only thing I will tell you is when you watch it, just be prepared to be broken. It will break you as a person. I've seen it one time. I will never watch it again. And I just bawled like a child at the end of it. And you will too. You will be angry and sad at the end of that documentary. But nevertheless, it is a masterpiece. It is genius work. And everybody should see it. But maybe don't see it alone, and don't see it if you're already depressed, because it will devastate you.
I think I'm emotionally too fragile for it right now, because just hearing you describe it has me near tears. And I don't even know what it's about.
I don't know that I could watch it now. I watched it probably
I'm very emotionally fragile now that I have young children.
I watched it 7 or 8 years ago. I don't know that I could watch it now. I can't get through the Watts documentary.
I couldn't watch the Watts documentary.
Chris Watts. I can't get through the Chris Watts documentary. I don't think I could get through it. But it is an absolutely brilliant piece of cinema. And if you are up to it, it is amazing. And I will recommend that one. I will recommend it. It's one of those things where you recommend it and then tell people don't watch it. Right? It's that amazing. It is that heartbreaking. It is that just shattering. So prepare yourself if you're going to watch it. But you asked for recommendations, and that's my recommendation for just amazing documentary. All right, Alice. Well, if you guys out there, you have any thoughts about the hollow moon, if you're upset with us that you think the moon's not hollow, or you're upset that we think people actually landed on the moon and walked around on it several times, as a matter of fact, and we'll probably go back anytime now and do it again. If you're upset with us about that, shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod for all your social media. Prosecutorspodcast.com is our website. Nobody ever visits it. There's so much stuff on it. All the links from this episode are going to be on it, so you can read all about the hollow moon theory. If you visit, you should. Thank you to everybody who joined us in the chat, and especially those of you who were mocking us for doing this theory the whole time and then came around at the end, because, of course, we were going to come to truth, justice, and knowledge when it was all over, and that's where we're going to end up, guys. You got to enjoy the journey. The journey's part of it. So I hope you enjoyed it, and hello to those of you on YouTube watching this. If you love our episodes and you want to get them early and ad-free, join Patreon. And one of the perks of Patreon is you can also join us as we record these live. And you can see Alice's smiling face. My smiling face is probably not much of a benefit, but Alice's is always wonderful to see. Alice, do you have anything else you want to add before we sign off?
No, thanks for sticking with us, both after Adnan and Hollow Moon Theory hypothesis. And we love you guys. It has been such a wild ride going through all these types of cases with you, and I look forward to many more.
Yes, and we'll be back next week, and next week it'll be true crime. So those of you who don't like these detours into the unusual, the strange, the esoteric, and the conspiratorial, next week we'll be back with a true crime case and one that needs more attention and doesn't get it. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. And Alice, I've already promised them that I'm going to clip the
I know, I saw that.
Because I mean, it was amazing. I mean, you just like...
It wasn't amazing.
I love the way people were like, Alice's voice has changed. Her whole face has changed. I was like, yeah, that's she's in it now, guys. We're like, this is what happens. I mean, that was like, it was seriously like when the judge says, "Are you ready?" And you're like,
right.
Yes, you are, man. Please escort. And you stand up, like you go into that different. It's like
you
that.
gotta go into it.
That's what I always say, you know, whenever I'm doing anything in court, I'm always so nervous right up until the moment I speak.
Lost people. I see the eyeballs going down because we've been talking about Adnan.
No, it's, you know, we going on to the next episode. Okay, here we go. You ready? Let's do it. Let's do it.
I'm trying to talk about the moon. Are you ready
Alice
to introduce
is
me?
enough. I'm sick of this.
No.
I'm sick of this crap.
Sick of
I don't
it.
want to talk
So
about Alice anymore.
sick of it. Let's talk about how great
Let's do it.
Brett is.
Let's do it.
Okay, Scott, miss you.
I miss Scott too. Scott, pull one out for you, buddy. Okay, here we go.
See what hit blockbusters are streaming free this month during Popcorn Summer Movies on PlutoTV. Watch Django Unchained or Transformers Dark of the Moon for an action-packed evening, or The Truman Show and School of Rock for a good laugh with the whole family. Plus, PlutoTV has thousands of other free movies available on live and on demand.